This morning's gospel reading is a brief one from the 10th chapter of Matthew, verses 40 through 42. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, think back with me a minute to that first reading we heard from Dub, from the Old Testament, about Abraham and, to a lesser extent, Sarah. It's probably a familiar story to many of us. Abraham is sitting in the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Boy, that sounds familiar the last week, doesn't it? We've had enough heat of the day to last us till September. But anyway, he sees three men approaching. Now, we know that it's God because the narrator told us that, but Abraham doesn't know that yet. All he knows is that he's sitting there, more or less in the shade, and here come three travelers walking along the dusty road, traveling, even in the heat of the day. They didn't wait till the sun went down. No. Here they come. Now, before we remind ourselves of the rest of the story, think for a moment about what you would do. What you might do if, let's say, you and your spouse are camped someplace, wherever your favorite place is to camp, and three strangers approach your tent. Would you be frightened? Might, right? Maybe. It might depend on what age they were, or what gender they were, or maybe how they were dressed, or if they were listening to some loud music that you could hear even though they had their earbuds in. Right? I suspect if it were me, I'd probably try to look real busy all of a sudden, right? In the hope that they would pass by and not disturb me. Like, gee, I need to break all these sticks into kindling all of a sudden. Don't mind me. Yeah. Would you greet them as they approached, maybe, something non-committal like hot enough for you today? Yeah. Would any of us do what Abraham did? Get up and run from our tent to meet them. And remember, Abraham's 100 years old now. And this is the desert. It's hot as Hades. Nevertheless, he gets up, he runs to greet them, he bows down to the ground before them, invites them to come sit in the shade of his tree, insists on washing their feet, and then kills a calf from his own herd to feed them. Would we do that? And I couldn't help but notice that Abraham serves the veal along with curds and milk, which is just a reminder that these are the days before keeping kosher was a thing. But would any of us react in that way to three strangers approaching us? I suspect not. And while that tells us something about ancient Near Eastern culture, and it tells us something about our own culture, I suspect it also, if we're honest, tells us something about ourselves as well. Among most nomadic cultures, particularly in ancient times, but it's true even of the few remaining nomadic peoples in the 21st century, if you are a nomadic group of people, then any stranger, any wanderer, any alien who appears, unless you know them to be an enemy, they are to be welcomed and cared for. That's a cultural rule. Now, you don't have to roll out the proverbial red carpet if you don't want to, but you have an obligation to provide them with food, water, shelter, a safe place to stay if it's late and the night is coming. That's not optional, because the desert is deadly. And if you had to make a desert journey, and you're a nomad, sooner or later you're going to have to make a desert journey, you want to be able to count on the kindness of strangers. Consequently, the expectation is that you should always expect to provide kindness to strangers. But even given that cultural norm, Abraham really does kind of go off the deep end, doesn't he? The hospitality that he and Sarah provide to these three wanderers is off the scale. And then they are 9 months later rewarded for it with a baby boy named Laughter, Isaac, Yitzhak. So, from Abraham, fast forward several centuries to today's brief gospel lesson, which comes from the tail end of the instructions Jesus is giving to the 12 as he sends them out on their mission of preaching and healing. He says to them, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me." It's almost as if Abraham had understood this centuries before, that when you welcome a stranger, you're welcoming God. Whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, none of these will lose their reward. By Jesus' time, a few hundred years after Abraham, there are fewer wandering nomads than there were in the time of Abraham. They're still in the desert, but far more people have moved into towns and villages. In Jesus' time, travelers may be at risk from thieves and bandits. They're less likely to be at risk of running out of food and water. Even so, the rites of hospitality and the rules of hospitality haven't changed very much in that interim. To welcome the stranger is to welcome Jesus. It is to welcome God. To minister to the stranger is to care for Jesus, is to receive the reward from God. So much for 2 and 3 millennia ago. How do we welcome the stranger in the 21st century world we now find ourselves in? A world very different from that of Abraham and of Jesus. Hospitality is increasingly a lost art, even among friends, neighbors, co-workers, to say nothing of non-strangers, of strangers. To welcome someone into our home often feels more like a burden than a blessing. Now, I confess, some of that may be a gender thing, all right? Lots of men I know feel perfectly okay about having some friends over, even if the house is a mess and there's nothing to eat in the fridge. After all, that's why God created DoorDash, right? But for most of us of the female persuasion anyway, having someone over to the house means cleaning for days, right? Fixing something special to eat, a seemingly endless list of preparations. After all, we're the ones who do things like cleaning the house before the maid comes, right? Which makes the men in our life look at us like we're certifiably nuts. At any rate, hospitality seems to have become more and more scarce in the days we live in and in the culture we live in. 25 years ago now, when I moved to Duncanville, our next door neighbor came over and welcomed us and brought us a chocolate pie. It's like, oh my God. At one level, that seemed really quaint, but at another level, what a beautiful thing that was. I tell myself I don't have time to do that kind of thing, but the truth is we all have time to do what's important to us. And I can't speak for all of you, but I suspect that for most of us here at least, we also have the money to do what's important to us. Maybe not the extras, but the important stuff. I suspect part of our difficulty is in choosing what's the most important. We have lots of choices. In a sense, it was a lot easier for Abraham. In many respects, compared to our life, his was very hard. But in some respects, it was easier in the sense that he didn't have as many things to choose from, right? Even in Jesus' time, this was true. A stranger shows up, dusty from the road, and whether you live in a tent like Abraham or in a small 2 or 3 room house like many in Jesus' day would have, there's no expectation that you can provide something elaborate for that stranger. There's really not all that much else going on in your life to keep you busy. Conversing with a stranger for a few hours might be the most interesting thing that happens to you all week. You provide a little meat, a little wine, a place to stay for the night, and in exchange you hear the news from other places that they've come from, stuff you don't have CNN to tell you about. Right? You may hear some really interesting, fun stories as well. Surely some of these travelers were really awesome storytellers. You didn't have to polish the silver, iron the tablecloth, vacuum the carpets, dust the cat, etc. You didn't have any of those things to worry about. But how many of us now, regardless of whether we kind of wanted to do it, how many of us would feel safe welcoming an unknown traveler into our homes? The world is different, but so are we. Nevertheless, just for a minute, imagine with me that situation. Someone shows up in your neighborhood and needs a place to stay for the night. Maybe their car broke down and there's no place within walking distance that says Motel 6 on it. They need a place to stay. How are you going to respond? Might it depend on how they were dressed? Would it depend on whether they were driving a car and what kind of car it was, and whether it looked like it was in pretty good shape or whether it was falling apart and held together with baling wire? Would any of us be brave enough to say, sure, come stay with us? I know I probably wouldn't. I may have 4 dogs, and what I need, where's Jennifer? What I need is a welcome mat that says wipe your paws, and I need them to read it. But even with 4 dogs to keep me safe, I don't know if I'd welcome a stranger into my home. So then what will I do? Would I offer to put them in my car and drive them to the closest motel and maybe pay for a night for them? If they, if they looked like that wasn't going to be a useful solution, would I offer to take them to the nearest shelter? I don't know where the nearest one is in Duncanville. I know there's at least one in Waxahachie. Would I take them? Would I ask them if they needed a meal? Maybe give them something to eat before I took them somewhere else? Would I say, gosh, I'm sorry, I can't help you, and just turn and walk away? See, even if we can't do hospitality and welcome in exactly the same way it was done in biblical times, how can we do it? Just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we get to decide it doesn't have to be done. So, I am willing to confess before you and God and everyone else, I am not willing to open my 2 spare bedrooms to homeless people. I'm not brave enough to do that. What am I going to do then to help provide shelter for those who are wandering and in need of help? Am I going to give some of my income and maybe some of my time to those places that do provide food and shelter? I know you all have made meals for Austin Street Center. Good for you. That's a part of hospitality. Am I going to volunteer my time doing something like that? I worked at the intake desk at the Stew Pot for a while, which was an eye-opening experience. What kind of volunteer opportunities are available for you in this community to show welcome to strangers or to those who are between homes, perhaps? Beyond that, though, am I going to ask uncomfortable questions of powerful people, such as, do you really think that bulldozing people's cardboard shacks is going to make them go away? Dallas City Council. Don't you think if they had somewhere else to go, that's where they'd be? Am I going to think about systemic problems like, why is it that homelessness continues to increase, but the number of people owning second homes is also at an all-time high? Oh no, she's quit preaching and gone to meddling, right? Look what happens when you try letting Jesus in. You start thinking about little things like offering a welcome and a cup of cold water or a PB&J sandwich, and you end up getting questions about not only your individual priorities and commitments, but about world political and economic issues. Like, don't even get me started about, would Jesus build a border wall? It might actually be simpler in the long run to let that stranger bunk in my spare bedroom than to take Jesus' teachings to their logical conclusions. It might, in the long run, even be less dangerous. Then I could tell myself I've done my piece and not have to ask myself and respond to the really hard questions. Of course, offering welcome and hospitality, just like everything else in discipleship, is not only about risk. It's also about reward. Jesus makes that very clear. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Think about risks of welcome that you personally have taken in the past. Good for you. Think about those you have not taken that maybe you might be ready to take. What rewards have you already received from your discipleship of welcome? And which ones might you be missing out on, at least so far? What risks are we together as a congregation perhaps being asked to undertake? Because as a group of us, that's always safer, less risky than individuals taking a risk. What could we together do that apart might not feel safe? Who is out there who needs to be welcomed, who needs a cup of cold water, who needs our hospitality? Where is Jesus, still waiting for us to recognize him while he is dressed as a stranger on the dusty road? And if we don't do it, who will? Amen.